Meet me at the apothecary's gate. Midnight. No one else must know. She glanced over her shoulder, the sensation of being followed gnawing at her nerves. The streets were silent save for the steady drum of rain. Yet she could feel it, an invisible presence, a weight in the air that made her skin prickle. She pulled her coat tighter and quickened her pace. At the appointed gate, a figure stood waiting, cloaked in shadow. Rosalind's breath caught. It was Marcus, his face half hidden beneath his hood. His eyes, sharp and piercing even in the dim light, locked onto hers. "You came," he said, his voice low, almost relieved. "You didn't leave me much choice," she replied, trying to mask her unease. "What is this about, Marcus?" "That note." "Not here," he interrupted, glancing around as if expecting someone to emerge from the darkness. "It's not safe to talk out in the open." "Safe?" Rosalind scoffed. "You're the one who dragged me out here in the middle of a storm." "Because it's important," Marcus hissed, stepping closer. "Do you trust me, Rosalind?" The question hung in the air, heavy and loaded. Did she? She thought of their years growing up together, of the loyalty they had shared. But things had changed since then. Marcus had changed, withdrawn, secretive. And now this. "Just tell me what's going on," she said, evading the question. Marcus hesitated, then reached into his coat and pulled out a bundle of parchment. He held it out to her, his expression grim. "Read this." Rosalind took the papers, her hands trembling slightly as she unfolded them. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the message was unmistakable. A plan, detailed and meticulous, to dismantle the Council of Elders. It was a conspiracy, bold and treacherous, and Marcus was clearly involved. Her eyes snapped to his. "What have you done?" "It's not what you think," he said quickly, his voice urgent. "The Council isn't what they seem, Rosalind. They've been lying to us, to everyone. This town, it's a prison, and we're all trapped in it." "That's absurd," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. She had always sensed something was wrong in Millworth. The way the Council seemed to know everything, their rigid control over every aspect of life. But to conspire against them? That was madness. "You need to trust me," Marcus said, stepping closer. "I didn't ask you here to recruit you. I asked you because I need your help. If I go down, they'll come for you too. They'll think you knew." Rosalind felt the blood drain from her face. "You've put me in danger." "I'm trying to protect you," he shot back, his voice rising. "But I can't do it alone. You've always been the smart one, Rosalind. The one who sees through things. I need you to see this for what it is, a chance to fight back." "Fight back against what?" she demanded. "Even if you're right, what can we do? We're just two people." Marcus's eyes burned with determination. "Two people can make a difference. You know that as well as I do." She opened her mouth to argue, but the sound of footsteps cut her off. They both froze, their breath shallow as the footsteps grew louder, closer. Rosalind turned her head, just in time to see a shadow detach itself from the darkness. "Well," the figure said, his voice smooth and mocking, "this is cozy." Rosalind's heart plummeted. It was Captain Rook, the head of the town's guard, and he was flanked by two others, their faces obscured by helmets. His sharp features twisted into a smile that didn't reach his cold eyes. "Out for a stroll, are we?" Rook drawled, his gaze flicking between them. "Or should I say, a conspiracy?" Marcus shifted, placing himself slightly in front of Rosalind. "We've done nothing wrong." Rook's smile widened. "Oh, I'm sure. A meeting at the apothecary's gate, in the dead of night, during a storm? Sounds perfectly innocent." Rosalind's mind raced. If Rook found the papers, it would be over for both of them. She clutched them tightly behind her back, praying he hadn't noticed. "Hand over the documents," Rook ordered, his tone suddenly sharp. "Let's see what you've been so busy with." "No," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the tension radiating from him. "You have no right." Rook chuckled, a low, menacing sound. "No right? I am the law, boy. And if you think—" Before he could finish, Marcus moved. It was fast, almost too fast to follow. He lunged at Rook, knocking him off balance. Rosalind's instincts took over, and she turned and ran, the papers clutched to her chest. "Stop her!" Rook bellowed, but she didn't look back. Her boots splashed through puddles as she darted down the twisting streets, her heart pounding like a drum. She didn't know where she was going, only that she needed to get away. Behind her, she heard shouts, the clang of metal, and then silence. The absence of sound was more terrifying than the noise. She slowed, pressing herself into the shadows of an alley, her breath coming in ragged gasps. A moment later, Marcus appeared, blood trickling from a cut on his cheek. His eyes were wild, but he was alive. "We need to move," he said, grabbing her arm. "Now!" She didn't argue. Together, they disappeared into the night, the weight of the conspiracy and their actions bearing down on them both. The connection. The storm clawed at the edges of the city like a feral beast, rain lashing against windows and thunder cracking the sky into jagged seams of light. Inside the dimly lit apartment, Lena sat cross-legged on the floor, her fingers ghosting over the array of objects spread before her. An ancient coin, a rusted key, a torn photograph. Each item thrummed with a faint energy she could feel in her bones. They weren't just remnants of the past. They were anchors to lives that had somehow, inexplicably, intersected with hers. She glanced at the screen of her laptop, where a scrambled map pulsed with erratic red dots. The program, her program, was supposed to help her track anomalies in the city's electromagnetic field. Instead, it had led her here, to this haunting collection of objects that seemed to whisper secrets she couldn't yet understand. A sharp knock at the door shattered her focus. Lena's head snapped up, her pulse quickening. Few people knew where she lived, and those who did wouldn't brave a storm like this for a social call. She stood, brushing her dark curls away from her face, and crossed the room cautiously. Through the peephole, she saw a man drenched from head to toe, his face obscured by the hood of his jacket. "Who is it?" she called, her voice steadier than she felt. Elliot came to reply, muffled by the storm, but unmistakably urgent. "I'm a friend of James. Please let me in." The mention of James froze her hand on the doorknob. James had been her closest friend, and the only person who truly believed in her work, until his sudden disappearance 6 months ago. She hesitated, weighing the risk, then unlatched the door. Elliot stepped inside, pulling back his hood to reveal sharp features, piercing green eyes, and a look of raw desperation. "I didn't know where else to go," he said, his voice low but insistent. "James told me you'd understand." "Understand what?" Lena asked, closing the door behind him and stepping back. She studied him warily, her mind racing. "Who are you? How do you know James?" "I don't have time to explain everything," Elliot said, his gaze flicking to the window as another crack of thunder rattled the glass. "But James and I were working on the same problem, tracking the disturbances. He said you were close to figuring it out, that you'd made connections." Lena's eyes narrowed. "Connections to what?" Elliot hesitated, then reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, sleek device. It looked like a cross between a smartphone and a miniature tablet, its surface alive with glowing symbols and shifting patterns. "To them," he said simply. The air between them seemed to still, the storm outside receding into background noise. Lena felt an electric charge ripple through her, the same sensation she got from the objects on her floor. She took a cautious step forward. "What is that?" "A conduit," Elliot replied, holding it out for her to see but not touch. "It's how they communicate, how they move through the city." "They?" Lena echoed, her voice barely above a whisper. Elliot locked eyes with her, his expression grim. "They're not human, and they're not from here." The words hung in the air, heavy and disorienting. Lena's rational mind rebelled against them, but something deeper, a gut instinct she had learned to trust, urged her to listen. She gestured toward the objects on the floor. "And these? Are they connected to them?" Elliot's gaze followed hers, and he nodded slowly. "They're markers, traces left behind when they passed through. You've been tracking them without realizing it." Lena sank onto the edge of the couch, her legs suddenly unsteady. She had spent years chasing patterns, anomalies, anything to prove that the world wasn't as static and predictable as it seemed. But this was beyond anything she had imagined. "Why are they here?" she asked. "What do they want?" That's what James was trying to figure out, Elliot said, his voice tinged with frustration. He thought they were searching for something or someone. But before he could finish his work, they found him. The implication hit Lena like a punch to the gut. You're saying they took him? Elliot nodded. And if you're as close as he said you were, they'll come for you too. Lena's mind raced, pieces of the puzzle clicking into place with terrifying clarity. The strange static she'd heard on her phone calls, the shadowy figures she thought she'd glimpsed on the edges of her vision, the way the objects seemed to hum louder when she held them. It all pointed to a presence she couldn't deny. What do we do? She asked, her voice steadier now, resolve hardening in her chest. Elliot set the conwood on the coffee table between them. We finish what James started. We find out what they're looking for, and we stop them before they take anyone else. Lena reached out hesitantly, her fingers brushing the edge of the device. A jolt of energy shot up her arm, and her vision blurred, replaced by a kaleidoscope of images. A faceless figure standing in a darkened alley, a glowing doorway pulsing with an otherworldly light, and James, reaching toward her with a look of silent warning. She gasped and pulled her hand back, her heart pounding. What was that? Proof, Elliot said grimly. They're closer than we thought. Before Lena could respond, the lights flickered and died, plunging the apartment into darkness. The storm outside intensified, the howling wind carrying with it a low, otherworldly hum that made the hair on the back of her neck stand on end. Elliot pulled a flashlight from his jacket and switched it on, casting long, jittery shadows across the room. They're here, he said, his voice barely audible over the din. Lena grabbed the torn photograph from the floor, clutching it tightly as if it could offer some kind of protection. What do they want from me? She demanded, her voice shaking. Elliot met her gaze, his expression unreadable. Not just you. Us. The hum grew louder, a vibration that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Lena felt it in her chest, her very bones. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the noise stopped. In the silence that followed, a single word echoed in her mind, clear and undeniable. Run. New beginnings. The town of Silverreach lay in the shadow of mountains that seemed to touch the heavens, their peaks perpetually capped with snow. The kind of town where secrets had nowhere to hide, yet they thrived all the same. On the eastern edge of its cobbled streets, nestled between the blacksmith's forge and a weathered apothecary, was the Willow Inn. It was here, on the first breath of spring, that fate gathered its pieces. Isla Marin had just finished polishing the counter when the door creaked open. She didn't look up immediately. Years of tending to weary travelers had taught her to let people settle before engaging. But when she finally glanced toward the entrance, her breath caught. The man standing in the doorway was a stranger, yet he carried an air of familiarity. His coat was tattered, his boots caked with mud, but his eyes burned with something sharp and unyielding. He scanned the room, pausing briefly on Isla before stepping inside and letting the door close behind him with a deliberate click. I need a room, he said, his voice low and rough, like a blade that had seen too many whetstones. Isla nodded, sliding the guest book toward him. Name? He hesitated, the barest flicker of something, guilt perhaps, crossing his face before he scribbled Kellen Roan. Isla's hand hovered over the key rack as her mind raced. The name wasn't common, but she couldn't place it. Still, there was no mistaking the tension that coiled around him, like a bowstring pulled taut. Room 3, she said, handing him the brass key. Kellen didn't thank her, merely nodded and disappeared up the stairs. The next morning, the town square was alive with its usual hum of gossip and commerce. Merchants hawked their wares, children darted between stalls, and the scent of freshly baked bread wafted through the air. Isla wandered among the throng, her basket half filled with supplies for the inn. She paused at the baker's stall, reaching for a loaf, when a voice stopped her. He doesn't belong here, you know. Isla turned to find Marin Delvine, the apothecary's daughter, watching her with narrowed eyes. Marin had a knack for knowing things she shouldn't, a talent that was both impressive and infuriating. Who doesn't? Isla asked, though she already knew. The man at your inn, Kellen Roan. Marin lowered her voice, her tone conspiratorial. There are rumors, whispers of what he's done. He's dangerous. Isla frowned, clutching the loaf tighter. And what exactly has he done? Marin hesitated, then leaned closer. They say he's running. From what? No one's certain. But wherever he goes, trouble follows. Isla wanted to dismiss it as idle chatter, but she couldn't shake the memory of Kellen's eyes. There had been something haunted in them, as if he carried the weight of countless regrets. Be careful, Marin added before disappearing into the crowd. That evening, as the sun dipped below the mountains and painted the sky in hues of gold and crimson, Isla found herself outside room 3. She hadn't intended to come, but the unease planted by Marin had grown roots, compelling her to seek answers. She knocked softly, and after a long pause, the door opened a crack. Kellen's face was shadowed, his expression unreadable. "What is it?" "I thought you might want dinner," Isla said, holding up a tray. It wasn't a complete lie. She had brought stew and bread. He stared at her for a moment before stepping aside. "Come in." The room was sparse, just a bed, a chair, and a small table. Kellen sat on the edge of the bed, his posture guarded. Isla set the tray down and took the chair, folding her hands in her lap. "People are talking about you," she said, deciding there was no point in dancing around the truth. Kellen's jaw tightened. "They always do. Why are you here?" He looked away, his gaze settling on the window. "I needed somewhere to stop. Somewhere quiet." Isla waited, sensing there was more. Finally, he sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. "There are people who want me dead, Miss Marin, and not without reason." Her stomach clenched, but she forced herself to remain calm. "What did you do?" Kellen met her eyes then, and the raw honesty in his gaze was almost unbearable. "I made a choice, one that cost people their lives. I thought I was doing the right thing, but I was wrong." Isla's throat tightened. She had no words, only the weight of his confession pressing down on her. "I'll leave in the morning," he said quietly. "I didn't mean to bring my trouble here." But something in Isla rebelled at the thought of letting him go. There was a sincerity in his regret that spoke to her, a glimmer of redemption buried beneath the scars. "No," she said firmly. "You don't have to run. Not anymore." Kellen stared at her, startled. "You don't understand." "I understand enough," she interrupted. "Stay. Let's figure this out together." For the first time since he'd arrived, Kellen's guarded facade cracked, and Isla glimpsed the man beneath. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Outside, the wind carried the promise of change. And for the first time in years, Isla felt as though she'd found a purpose worth fighting for. The next morning, the town woke to find Kellen in the square, helping the blacksmith carry iron bars from the forge. Whispers followed him, but so did curious glances. And on the horizon, hidden by the morning mist, shadows stirred, unseen, but not for long. The past might have chased Kellen to Silverreach, but the future would meet him here, and neither he nor Isla would face it alone.